Cuba's collapse was not simply because of communism. It's because of the psychopathy, stupid. And that little stupid, I'm directing it towards certain politicians, certain career politicians that should know better, that continue to defend the Castro regime. And since James Carville, the political strategist for Bill Clinton, who made famous the slogan, "It's the economy, stupid," which helped get Bill Clinton elected. Yeah, I would like to direct that towards certain Democrat politicians, namely, I'll name them: Bernie Sanders, AOC, and Mamdani. Okay, people who still think that communism could work, or socialism, because they're always trying to muddle the terms. And they would swear, I'm pretty sure if you had an honest conversation with them, they would be like, it would work, but the U.S. embargo is what kept socialism from working in Cuba. No, it was the psychopaths. And first of all, as it is, communism will never work. Okay, and it's not simply because the majority of people are too greedy and selfish, because that's the typical line you hear a lot of people saying. Well, communism it's a beauty. It's a beautiful idea, but people are just too greedy and selfish to make it work. No, it's not it. It's not because, and first of all, not everyone is that selfish and greedy. Not everyone is as selfish and greedy as the Castros were to begin with, okay? And every other communist tyrant that there is. No, the reason why communism will never work, and it even doesn't work on a small scale, even like in the kibbutzes from Israel, or even hippie communes that always fail, okay? On a larger scale, when you have more than 10,000, let alone 100,000 or more, 1 million people, there's no way one central planning committee can possibly anticipate and predict the future for millions of people, the economic activity. There's just so much going on, and something that a lot of communist-minded people don't understand is spontaneous order. You get spontaneous order actually from allowing people to be free. That's how things actually work. That's why millions of people get to have a cup of coffee every morning, without a centrally planned coffee committee, let alone a national one. Imagine if you needed to have a national, centrally planning coffee committee to ensure that everybody had at least one cup of coffee every morning. Okay. And then imagine if they start to fail and, some people have 2 cups of coffee and some people just can't even have one. And so they go ahead and they try to make a coffee quota for the year. And they try to gather like 10 million tons of coffee. That way they can ensure that everybody gets coffee. And they pull people out of other sectors, from the healthcare sector, they start requiring lawyers to show up and pick coffee beans. Even police are probably dragged into this collective effort to ensure that everybody has coffee. That's pretty crazy. I mean, most people will be like, that's insane. That sounds like a hypothetical, insane situation that's never going to happen. That happened in Cuba, not with coffee, but with sugar. And it was the 10 million ton quota of 1970 that was imposed by Fidel Castro. Okay. And it failed. It failed. They pulled people out of all sectors of society. Okay, and you can look this up. There's documentaries on this, and it was a dismal failure. They were not able to get that, and not only were they not able to meet that quota, which, by the way, could have been handled quite easily, as it probably was before when it was dealt by private companies. Aside from the fact that they couldn't even meet the quota, then there was just shortages in other sections of the economy because so many people were dragged out to go and do this for, I believe, a couple of months. Okay. And by the way, 1970 was also the year that my mother and my father were put into forced labor camps just to earn the right to be exiled out of their own country. With all that they could fit into 2 suitcases. That was it, because everything else was confiscated. And my parents were middle class. They were a middle-class couple. My father was an accountant. My mother worked at a bank. And by that point, everything was already nationalized. So they got fired to top it off. Once they, declared that they wanted to leave the country, because they, along with many other Cubans, were saying that there was a dictatorship spreading like a cancer, that's when they were marked That's when they were made to go to a forced labor camp and have everything confiscated before they can leave. And the stories of the milicianos that shamed and tried to humiliate my mother almost on a daily basis when she was at the forced labor camp, hosing her down in the nude, before she could leave, and all the other women that worked there. The reason why the Castros didn't go overboard with their cruelty is because they knew they were being watched, and watched by a bunch of pseudo-intellectual, useful idiots, people like this guy, Jean-Paul Sartre, the one guy that had claimed that Che Guevara was the most perfect human being. I think he retracted himself on that, but yeah, him and the Noam Chomskys and I think Michel Foucault, all these other philosophers at the time who were seeing Cuba, and even Christopher Hitchens, one of my favorite writers, who actually went, and at least he saw it. Once Christopher Hitchens went and volunteered his time in this social experiment of communism in Cuba, it's in his own autobiography. That's when he realized, okay, yeah, this is a problem. Maybe communism in its purest form can't work, but he still held on to the idea of socialism, and that's why he supported Hugo Chavez. But the psychopathy that also took over Venezuela is the same, and it's a shame because it's these people are byproducts of nature too. I'm not trying to excuse them in any way, shape, or form, but apparently there are people who are neurological psychopaths, and they cannot compute empathy. They cannot empathize with the suffering of others, but what they can feel, some of them, the sadistic psychopaths, they can feel pleasure from the suffering of others, especially when they are creating that suffering themselves for their own selfish gain. And these people are a byproduct of nature. And these are the people that make up these dictatorships and create the dystopian nightmares such as what Cuba is nowadays. Cuba is now almost literally a steaming pile of garbage all around the country, except for the hotels that tourists still go to along the beaches of Varadero, where the average Cuban cannot go into those hotels, but many tourists can, and there's a consistent amount of, consistent pipeline of tourists who go there. Canadians, from what I understand, I'm not blaming all Canadians, but there's enough Canadians, the Justin Trudeaus of Canada, I would imagine, are the ones that patronize these hotels, and it's two different worlds. It's two different worlds. And whichever Cubans do get to go in there and vacation, they're usually part of that 1% of the military that Marco Rubio so perfectly described in his address to the Cuban people last week, and how the Castro regime is just robbing Cuba of not only all its resources, but its human potential. So that's the worst part about it. The worst part about it is not only all the resources and the fact that people are just left, economically stranded. It's the human potential. The human capital has been squandered and excused by so many people, so many useful idiots in this country, people too many to name, that are still blaming the U.S. embargo instead of that murderous regime. And it's just insane. And it needs to be pointed out, again, it's not simply the communism that failed Cuba, which is in no way, shape, or form to say that communism could work if given the chance. Not at all. There's many logistical reasons why communism will never work. It bottlenecks innovation. It undermines accountability. It thwarts the natural, spontaneous order that you get with healthy competition in order to solve problems and in order to create abundance. Aside from those reasons why communism will never work, it's the psychopaths that use it. And by the way, the biggest proof that it's not the communism that was the problem, it's the fact that the Castros themselves, they don't live by communist standards. They live lives of luxury. You could see it even with his grandson, now Raulito el Cangrejo. And there's plenty of pictures of him on yachts, just enjoying and living as high a life as they can, because apparently there's only so much that they can get over there, but they get quite a bit. I know that from from South Florida, a lot of goods are actually sent over through these companies that are run by Gaesa, basically the psychopaths in the military. So when you want to help your relatives that are over there, which there's another point of contention, which I could do a different video on that, about to what degree should we be helping our relatives over there? Because every time you help your relatives over there, you're literally paying for that dictatorship. And by the way, at the places that send the goods, you can almost see that. I don't want to judge too harshly, especially if I don't have the evidence. But I can sense that the people who work at these places, they're part of that. They know first of all, they have to know what's going on. You know, if there's so much shortages over in Cuba, shortages on food and medicines, but for the right price, they just materialize the next day. That's because the government hoards the goods. And it doesn't take a private eye to figure that one out. And you can feel it when you go to these places and you go and you either try to send money to your relatives or you try to send goods. These people have no basically incentive to treat you well or treat you friendly. No, they know you have to almost go there. You want to help your relative, you have to go to one of those places. They're not trying to be nice. They have like these faces of like just, you know, I don't know. I don't want to judge. Maybe it's because they also have family over there. Maybe they're suffering. It's not that I want to see people suffering in any way, shape, or form, but it's a disgusting mess. What certain human beings can do to an entire nation, and how many other human beings will excuse it and legitimize it at the highest levels of our Congress. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. But every problem has a solution, and we can only hope that that Cuba will be free in 2026. Hopefully Iran as well, because as bad as things are in Cuba, Iran is so much worse. And as cruel and murderous as the Castro regime can be, they are almost an NGO in comparison to the IRGC in Iran. But I'll make another video about that, about how communism and Islam tend to be the fuel for so many tyrannies. But the last point I do want to make regarding the communism, one thing that does fuel communism, aside from the psychopathy, is the envy, the collective envy of so many people. People who just cannot stand to see someone else be more successful than them. People who, instead of trying to learn, like, hey, wow, that's your business is doing great. How do you do it? How can I learn from you? What is it that you do? No, they just want to take away from you. They want to take. And by the way, that's what the entire Castro regime does. They don't produce, they take, which kind of reminds me about a lot of Democrats. Sorry, you have to point it out, but that's the party that takes the most in this country. And in blue-run cities within blue-run states, they are hemorrhaging. Number one, their tax-paying base, because you can only tax people so much before they leave, if and as long as we still have the freedom to do that. And they're just destroying, they're running those cities to the ground. And it's undeniable, it's irrefutable. And that's why there's so much attention on Trump and that stupid ballroom and the Epstein files, because that is a collective distraction and projection of their own failures that they don't want anyone to see. They don't want people like Nick Shirley to continue to shame them. That's why Gavin Newsom had such a problem with Nick Shirley. And the amount of people, friends that I know, that if you're watching this video, please start waking up to what the Democrat Party's doing. Stop letting me know what a jerk Trump is and start, how about you start opening your eyes to people like Gavin Newsom and Ilhan Omar and Karen Bass, who, by the way, Karen Bass, the mayor of LA, who basically let that city almost literally burn. Big Castro fan, big Castro supporter. I'm no neurologist to say that she's a psychopath, but I don't know. I just hope more people can start learning from this. Aside from the fact that I hope that Cuba does become free in 2026, I hope lessons will be learned and never to be repeated again. Anyway, hope this all makes sense. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, check out the links below for my original art and merchandise, and thanks for watching.